Welcome to our Chief Diversity Officer webinar. This is a 1-hour session with leading Chief Diversity Officers covering 3 topics. The first one is unique perspectives from our Black and Brown panelists who are well-known leaders in the DE&I community. 2, we'll talk about civil unrest and CEO response to the events that have happened as of late. 3, a global perspective on DE&I during the COVID crisis. And 4, the importance of inclusive leadership, followed by the path ahead. My name is Shah Paikeday. I lead Global D&I Advisory Services at Russell Reynolds Associates, a global executive search and leadership advisory firm. In our practice, we do 3 things in working with companies. We develop D&I strategy and operating models. We assess and develop inclusive leadership skills, and we recruit chief diversity officers. The last part of that is my favorite part of my job because I get to meet so many executives who are dedicated to social justice, not just now, but for a lifetime. And hearing their stories about why they do this work is so inspiring. So please allow me, without further ado, to introduce our distinguished panelists. I am joined by Candy Castleberry-Singleton. Candy is the Vice President of Diversity, Partnership Strategy, and Engagement at Twitter. She is also the founder of the award-winning Dignity and Respect campaign, which has helped organizations create more inclusive work environments. She has developed successful strategies and initiatives in technology, telecommunications, healthcare, including Xerox, Sun Microsystems, Motorola, and UPMC. We will be joined in just a moment by Leslie Mays. Leslie serves as Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where she was responsible for ensuring the integration and impact of diversity, equity, and inclusion across all of the areas of the foundation, including culture, talent, grant making, and programmatic outcomes. She's been a pioneer in practical application of advanced workforce analytics to effectively build future-focused HR and DEI measurable results. And last but not least, Shinder Dhillon, who is the Vice President of Inclusion and Diversity for Fortive. Shinder has a responsibility for creating and leading the I&D strategy across the global operating committees in partnership with business leaders and HR. With nearly 2 decades of experience in the field of I&D in various industries in Europe and the US, including senior roles at Microsoft, Air Products and Chemicals, and Pfizer. So with that, I would love to get started with our discussion, and we'll give Leslie a minute to join us. I know this is a busy time for our Chief Diversity Officers, all of those who are on the phone, so really appreciate your making time to join us. Let's start the discussion, at this very challenging time where we are, unfortunately, at the end of a series of tragic deaths, including that of George Floyd and many others who passed before him. Our panelists each have a unique perspective on this civil unrest that has swept across our country and many parts of the world. And would love to first start with your introductory comments on your perspective on this particular topic. And with you, Candy, in particular, wanted to ask, in your role at Twitter, what is the role of social media during this time of civil unrest?
First, thank you, Tina, for all that you do and for not just for bringing us together today, but keeping the voice of Chief Diversity Officers and those doing this work at the forefront of the work that's happening at Russell Reynolds, and clearly with all the partners that you engage with. I come to these conversations with a heavy heart, 1, as a Black person, 2, as a person who has had my own experience with the police. As you know, I shared this with Tina when I was 12 years old. On my way home from school, I was confronted by 6 white officers who accused me of robbing a hamburger stand. I can tell you that every moment that you all see something perhaps for the first time, I relive that experience even today as an adult. And I was also married to a police officer later in life, not when I was 12, but I married a police officer who was also Black. And I was actually more concerned about him being a Black police officer, both because of what I knew was happening both on the force and on the streets for Black people. I think that for Black people, this is obviously our lived experience. We kind of just live in a world where this has been the case. And so what I think about social media, when I was 12, there was no way to capture that. It was just what I experienced and the one person who was there. And today, social media has created an elevated visibility to that which has been happening to Black people, and quite frankly, to others for many decades. I also think the role of an organization like Twitter provides, quite frankly, the ability to tell the story, to see the story, to fact check the story. And what it's quite frankly done is given amplification to those things that we know have been happening in our communities. And then the only thing that I would add is that it has given visibility to that which I would distinguish between PR and the position that many organizations are taking today, and that which organizations are actually doing from an HR perspective. And I hope that for those of you who are listening, know that diversity and inclusion officers have had plans for many decades for this kind of work. And in this moment, a part of the reason we're being pulled in many directions, even like today, we're being asked to accelerate the things that we have proposed for many years. So with that being said, I think we have to do more of leaning in to HR and a little bit making sure that that's aligned with that which is the PR statements that we're making about where our companies are.
Thank you, Candy. I appreciate the personal along with the professional. And as we turn to Shinder, I think my question for you is, has leadership commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion changed in any way at this time?
Thank you, Tina, and thank you for having me. It has. I mean, I've, as you said, I've been doing, and I think like the other panel members, right? We've been in this, and hi, Leslie, because I haven't seen Leslie for years, and we used to work together. It's nice to see you.
It's good to see you.
So, we've been in this work for a long time. And I think, like all of us, I think my panelists will agree with me, this is nothing new, right? This has been part of the work for a long time. And as people of color, this is our world, right? We get born into it, we live it, and we deal with it, right? So it's not new. And I think what's been interesting in the change that I've seen is, in the past, in certain organizations that I've worked in, you're kind of knocking at the door, right? And nobody's opening it. And the change that I've seen is the door is now opening, and they're pulling you in. And so, whereas before, and I live not far from Seattle, and I sometimes use the term that this kind of work is you're pushing a rock up a hill and it's raining. And so now you're definitely getting pulled in versus the push. So that's a big change that I've seen. The other thing I've seen is that, and this is a kind of a danger, and this is the conversation we're having in my company, is that the natural tendency is to jump to action, right? That's what, I work with a bunch of, it's an engineering company, and even scientists and software engineers, and my youngest son is a mechanical engineer now, so I know how his brain is. It's like, what's the problem, right? Problem statement, let's then go and solve it. And so whereas this is to take a pause. So we're really listening, learning, and then action, right? So that's one of the other things, that I'm seeing a big change is the leaning in to quickly take action. Right? But we got to make sure that whatever action we take is going to be sustainable. And the last thing I'd say that I'm seeing a big change is in the past, a lot of us, and I hands up that I've done this myself many moons ago, where I was a bystander, right? I would see conversations taking place, you know, by the water cooler, so to speak, and I would either walk by or I would pretend I didn't hear them. And, you know, and the big change now is that there are many more people saying, how can I be an ally? And not, you know, we cannot be bystanders anymore. So those are the three things that I would say I've seen really change with what's going on in the world today. It's just that push and versus pull, the kind of leaning in for the action, and then just the allyship. So that's heartening to see. I mean, there's part of me that says, really, people, it's taken us this long. And then there's the other part of me that says, well, thank God that we are here, right? And that now it's time to, you know, seize that opportunity and really take it and run with it.
Yeah, it's quite a moment. And thank you, Leslie, for joining us. I know that this is a busy time given all that is going on. So welcome. You know, and as we introduce kind of your unique lens on this particular topic, you know, the question I might ask is, how has the crisis impacted your role as the head of DE&I at the Gates Foundation?
Where do I begin? My life is no longer my own. So thank you also for allowing me to join you today. My apologies for joining just a little bit late. I explained to Tina that we were right in the middle of a conversation with our CEO with a group of Black employees talking about this very subject, and really thinking through what, and bringing additional voice to what is it that the foundation needs to be focused on right now, and not in terms of just talking about it, but moving to action. As the largest philanthropic organization in the world, I think we have tremendous impact in so many countries in all that we do. We have two of the most visible champions in Bill and Melinda Gates, who are on every media source during this period. And so how do we leverage that to really open the door to an honest discussion on the racial inequities that have existed, not only in the United States, but around the globe. So I guess I'm in a position where I joined the foundation last fall in September, relocated to the Seattle area. Excuse me, relocated to the Seattle area. And just as my husband and I were getting settled in, that's when everyone went to a work from home status due to COVID. So the world has just kind of flipped on its side for all of us. And then in addition to that, you know, the recent string of killings that have become visible across the United States have just ramped the discussion even more in terms of social justice, racial inequality. And so we are at this point of very interesting convergence in an organization that was founded on the belief, very, very visibly stated, that all lives have equal value. And juggling all of that, in addition to helping to articulate and identify the specific levers that we need to pull from a DEI strategy standpoint, is almost overwhelming. So as Shinder said, we worked together 15 years ago.
Oh my God.
I was thinking about that this morning when we were both advisor, and here we are fighting some of the same battles today. But I do believe that we are at a tipping point. I think that this is a unique point in time, and as I've always described it, I think Shinder may remember this way back when we worked together, a window has opened. And we have to push as much through that window as DEI leaders and executives in our organizations as possible. Because when the news cycle changes, and it will change, and it will shift to something else, it doesn't mean that this need will go away, but we have to have been strategic. We have to work with urgency. and make things happen in a way that we haven't before.
Yeah.
The last point that I'll make is I absolutely agree with Shinder's perspective that I too, even as a new leader in the foundation, am feeling, a very, very strong pressure, and I mean it in a positive way, to do something now. There is this, this desire for, we got to do something, we have to make statements, we've got to put money into it. And it's almost like you're holding back the floodgates to say, let's be very strategic and thoughtful so that what we do in this period of time does have sustainable impact going forward. That's the one opportunity I think that we have to focus on. It's balancing the need for urgent response with what are we going to do that's sustainable and that will have impact.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I think, there's a question that's come in from the audience about what guidance is in terms of wanting to see outcomes at this particular time. And I think, to your point, Leslie, there's been a tremendous, desire to make public statements. And recently our D&I practice, has been focused on advising CEOs on the response to the current situation. And, at first we were advising on whether to respond. And then it was clear that most folks were going to respond. So how should they respond and what should they say? And now we're focused on, how do we deliver upon all of these promises? And in the analysis that we did, we looked at large cap companies, 100 randomly sampled companies across the S&P 500. And what we found was that 75% of those companies made a statement denouncing racism. 50% of those companies made a statement and also held company-wide conversations on the topic or pledged money. 30% acknowledged that there's more work to be done internally, so significant drop off, almost half. 10% made plans for improvement internally, and 5% have immediately taken some kind of action, right? So to that point on balancing taking action with a sustainable strategy, I'll turn back to you, Candy, and my question is, how do you approach this very sensitive topic, and what's different this time, right? The social injustice that has occurred is not new. What's different?
Well, I think the difference is we're actually talking about race. I think for many of us who've been in this work for a number of years, we have to some degree moved away from conversations about race and tried to broaden it to using words like diversity and more inclusive, words like inclusion, words like belonging. And we moved in that direction sometimes without addressing that which was the race issue and conversation that was happening both in the world and in the workplace. I think the other thing that comes to mind when I think about this is that for all the work that we've done, for the decades that the work was done and has been done, and work that has been done both by those on this call, those listening to this call, and those who did this work before us, the work has primarily benefited women. So if you look at the research, quite frankly, the benefactors of this work have been women, and Black people often are the groups that have benefited the least. And so while we have wrapped up this context of inclusion and then broadened it to include all underrepresented groups, we have not made the kind of progress both in society and in the workplace that has benefited Black people. And so that which is happening outside of in society is now spilling into the workplace, and people who otherwise may not have said something are speaking up. And so organizations are now going to be forced to lean in on that which is a conversation that we've not had about race, and two, to create hopefully greater accountability for ensuring that Black people are a part of the benefactors of the work that we've been doing for years. I often think about the fact that sustainable change is not going to happen by words. It's not going to happen by PR statements. It's going to happen because organizations create shared accountability in the organization with HR, with PR, with communications, with procurement, and the way that we think about how we go out to bid and who we partner with from a vendor perspective, including philanthropy. And so the work cannot sit simply in the lane of D&I and accountability. It has to be shared. And by the way, it should be shared and more transparent. And I also think we're forced to deal with this sort of pre-May 25th and post-May 25th society. And so for many who have either been allies or doing the work, who have been leaning in on trying to ensure the environment is inclusive and that all demographics, including Blacks, have been included, they are now also not able to easily distinguish between those who are having this conversation for the first time and whether they're organizations or leaders. And so I think it's really important for us to think about the fact that sustainable change is going to maybe led and maybe the outspoken language may come from Black people, but sustainable change is going to come from all of us working together across all these functions, as well as the allies pre and post to help us to sustain the work such that we don't make progress in this moment while people are making this an attention, putting attention on it and moving to a place where this becomes who we are as a part of the DNA of our organizations.
Yeah, really good point. And it's, acknowledging right now, right, that we need to stand in solidarity with our Black colleagues, friends, family, and at the same time bridge to the allies who have been there and who are stepping up. And Shinder, my question for you is, how do you serve as a bridge in the work that you're doing at Fortive?
Sorry, I was on mute. We have our rubbish collected today, so I didn't want you to hear that. So you may still be hearing that. What I would say is, how I come at it is more from how do we create the right environment for everybody? And it is about all of us. So, as a brown person, and, I've definitely had experiences, and I think Leslie kind of alluded to this in that, this all shall pass and there'll be something else, right? When I think of 9/11, that was, we were actually in Ann Arbor, Michigan at the time. And my husband, had a beard at the time and he was walking down the road and there was a white van that stopped, had about 4 white people in it, white men, and just called him slurs and said, Packy, go back to where you came from. And so, and my kids have been discriminated against in school, talked, horrible things that they were called because they were the only brown kids in school at the time. So we've all had different experiences, right? And I know that many more people have had much more worse things happen to them than I have. And so what I try to do is really think about the inclusion piece. And for me, that was one of the reasons when I joined Fortive. I was 3 months into the role and I actually switched my title. And it's actually, the group, it's inclusion and diversity. Because to be quite frank, and I know, and I say this, that my HR peers, especially in talent, hate when I say it, but I still say it, in that the diversity part is the relatively easier part, right? You can bring those folks in, but if your culture is not going to support the right environment and they don't feel they belong, you're just creating a revolving door. So I purposefully really switched it to inclusion and diversity. And the other part was because people were, they automatically jump to gender because that's the only one thing that's global. And so and that's an easier conversation to have, right, than the race one. So for me, and the inclusion is about everybody everywhere. And especially when you're a global company, we hear from, and I hear this even in my company, it's very US centric. So how do we really, and when you start to really also focus on the inclusion, and don't get me wrong, we have to do both. It's not one or the other, it's both. So it's really, the inclusion component is really important. And what I've also found is I've really got to be also careful that you don't end up alienating people. And the matter of the fact, whether we like it or not, in the US, the large majority of the companies, the senior leaders are white men. but we need them with us to really make the change that we need to make. So how do we bring them on the journey with us? And then the other piece that I would say that I do is really meeting people where they're at. Like, everybody's had a different experience. Everybody's in a different place. And I really try hard, and I don't always succeed, because there's times when I mess up and I know my own hot buttons are triggered, is really meeting people where they're at. And if I can really empathize and try to understand that, then I know, how do I now move forward with them? So those are the things that I really try to focus on, you know, as I'm really kind of pushing and creating and refining, I just say, our strategy to move forward.
Yeah, and thank you for raising the topic, right, of the conversation from the U.S. Has been our focus so far on this panel, and I think we have a global audience on the line. And so let's shift to what's happening in DE&I and other parts of the world, including Europe, Asia, and Africa in particular. One of the questions that has also come in from the audience, I think, is related to the topic we're going to talk about next, which is this global view at a time when we are experiencing the COVID crisis, right? So my question is for you, Leslie. How has the intersection of social justice in the U.S. impacted the work that the foundation is doing globally in healthcare?
Mm-hmm. I think that the way that I would approach the question is a couple of ways. One is internally, and then as we think about the work that the foundation has very visibly been doing on COVID. You know, I think that there is a very, very strong intersection and lots of opportunity to learn, but starting internally, and the foundation is a very different type of nonprofit in that it drives very, very clear strategies that are focused on outcomes, that are focused on impact. It's not just a nice giving organization that writes checks. We bring technical expertise with the checks. We identify key partners. And in reality, the foundation is only about 1,700 people. But our real focus in the way that we do our work is through hundreds of partner organizations around the globe. And so I think that we both have to get our internal house in order, but we are also helping our partners deal with some of the realities from just an equity and inclusion standpoint as well. And again, most of our work, with the exception of the work that we do in the U.S. education system, is outside of the United States. So we are still kind of getting our arms from a DEI standpoint around how we execute through those cultures, through those countries, through the partners that we work with, to really have, again, impact. And you'll hear us talk a lot about impact. It's not just outcomes, it's not just measures, it is impact is our primary focus. With COVID, again, we have seen, and let me start here in the United States, that one of the ways that we've been able to really engage and influence and create more attention, especially I think since, this is my personal opinion, it's widely recognized that I think the US government has not necessarily taken the aggressive leadership position that's necessary on things like testing, on access to care, et cetera, in a consistent fashion. And so I think that we have been one of those major influences and forces that have tried to help right the conversation while also providing resources, bringing the right parties together to consider things like, again, testing, vaccines, longer term solutions to this work. I think that in much the same way that we are focused here in the United States, we are also doing the same in other countries. I'm pivoting back and forth, and I recognize that, but I think that when we look at who or the populations that are most greatly impacted by COVID, again, that it begins to speak to and intersect with the organization's commitment on DEI. So DEI isn't just about the workforce. It's not just about what we do internally. It's integrated into everything that we do, all of our program areas, our relationship with our partners, the very work that we do. So we're in the process of bringing all of this together to, again, help focus the world or the parts of the world that we're engaged and involved in sort of advancing solutions to COVID. We're really trying to think about this as holistically as we possibly can. And there are multiple work streams that are going on, highly technical, medical solutions, research, development. And so I think that obviously COVID has created a new world order for all of us. And it's something that we have to pay attention to. I would also say that, again, as we think about our global workforce as well, I was speaking with our senior leadership team earlier this week and kind of offering my reflections from the last 6 months. And I want to tie it back to the impact of COVID on the work that we all do on DEI. And so when you go into an organization, obviously, or when you join an organization to do this work, you first look for the anchors. I mean, you don't want a DEI program or initiative that just kind of sits out there on its own. I think it's got to be finely integrated into the business. It has to be finely integrated into the practices and the culture of the organization. So you're anchoring on those things like leader behaviors, like the culture of the organization, the value proposition, the leadership perspective. And in the face of COVID, at least for me, and I'm sure it may be true for many of the folks who are on the line, all of those things have shifted. And so what do you anchor to? You have a new normal in terms of remote working, which is really impacted how we interact and collaborate. You have a new definition for workplace culture, which, again, it's not people coming together in buildings. It's very, very different. We have a new normal in terms of the need to integrate family and life challenges, and that is really creating a lot of tension and consternation. And then in my case, we also have a completely new leadership team because our CEO changed out maybe 2 months ago. So in the midst of all of this, and again, I'm relatively new to the organization, what do we anchor to? And so that's the thing that I am, to go back to the question that you asked earlier about bridging, it's just kind of figuring, okay, this new world, how do we do this work that we are committed to doing when all of the, again, anchors that we are so accustomed to are now changed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really, really, really good point. And, I want to turn to some of the topics you're talking about in just a moment, as there's a question coming in from the audience in terms of how do we open up the conversation. And part of what I want to do before I go there is, I think what's really nice about this community is we can have these real and candid conversations about topics that are difficult to talk about. And, my question to you, Candy, is just, the question that's on the back of a lot of people's minds is, would the reaction to the George Floyd incident have been the same without COVID?
Yeah, actually, I think that's a great question. Two things. One is, I think between social media and COVID and people being in their homes for some period of time, there was sort of this built up tension. Obviously, we have seen Black people killed on video. I remember as early as the Rodney King, he didn't die, but I remember seeing that. And I remember the outcomes of that. It didn't obviously sustain as long as this has, and it clearly didn't take the kind of global footprint. One is, I think you have a more woke generation and one that is more willing to be active in the workplace, as well as particularly in tech. And in the community. I think the second is that because people have either been impacted financially, they are in different living and life circumstances. That combined created what my personal perspective is almost like, and it's not, I mean, I think the term perfect storm is the right sort of scenario, but when you think perfect, none of this is perfect. So don't get me wrong when I say that, but I think it's the combination, the layers of activity that created, I think, the amount of visibility and the amount of activation that is taken in the streets. I also think when I think about this, it is important to acknowledge that the context of these things is not new for us as Black people. It's not new, quite frankly, to many people who have been paying attention pre-May 25th. It's only new to a group of people that have perhaps not either paid attention or perhaps have lived in a space where they aren't interacting with it as often. And so perhaps it's possible that they didn't know. But what I can say that COVID has done is not only exacerbated that which happened to George Floyd and many people before him in creating visibility, but it also, I think, has exacerbated our understanding and knowledge of how diverse communities more broadly are impacted. So when you think about, we did a speaker series, my role really is to bridge public policy and that which is happening outside with that which is happening on the inside, or so societal issues that may also impact our workforce. Clearly, this is one of them. Along with COVID, we hosted a speaker series, and we had we had 7 demographic groups come and talk, different demographic groups come and talk to us about how they were uniquely impacted, from the xenophobia that was impacting the Asian community to how the CARES Acts and how many people in the Latinx community were intentionally excluded from obviously some of the payments that were made if they were an ITN, to the way that the disability community was impacted, to the way Black people were impacted, which was an exacerbation of that which we already knew about health disparities. And so I think what this sort of perfect storm has created is visibility to a lot of things that have already pre-existed in society that were impacting demographic groups more broadly. And now we're actually seeing it because we're stuck inside or on Zoom calls or video calls that are often sideways streamed, side streamed with something that's happening on whatever news feed or perhaps even Twitter. So I think that when you think about the crisis itself, combined with all the other things that are happening, it feels, quite frankly, very heavily weighted. And in many cases, the people on this call who are doing I&D work, I hope that you are giving them some grace, because we are expected to not only understand how to engage our employees, to partner with organizations externally who are diverse, in addition to our own impact that may be coming at us directly related to our own life and families in COVID. So George Floyd is at the center of this, but there's so many things that are surrounding it that are all D&I related.
Yeah, absolutely. Mindful that we do need to end the session promptly before the top of the hour. And I do want to ask Leslie kind of one very specific question before we move to the path ahead, which is, we've been talking about Black lives in the US. A lot of the work that the foundation does is on the continent of Africa. How do you think about, the disparities that are occurring there versus here?
I think they're very real. And, so one of the questions, and I want to tie a couple of things together, when we started kind of responding to, the need for discussions and dialogues and learning and, just giving people an opportunity to vent or just process what was going on in the United States, we heard from several colleagues in Africa, in our regional Africa office, which spans about 4 different countries, that while this has started as sort of like a US race issue, it absolutely pertains to every country that we operate in, and particularly in Africa or across Africa. And so I think they are even for ahead of what some of the responses that we are mounting in the United States, and really thinking about the types of solutions and actions that need to be taken to uncover and unveil, I guess, where the inequities lie in our organization and our practices with our partners and addressing those. So I'll give you an example. In a lot of international organizations, or those that with an international footprint, and I'm sure many of the folks on this call have experienced this. If you do work in other countries, whatever continent that they may be on, I think US-based companies typically have used or leveraged expats who are largely Americans to go to those countries and to establish and run offices. I think that some of the work that I've done in the past, and certainly that we're looking at here, is how do we change that equation? How do we shift the power that has been so sort of the routine that many organizations have come to practice, and distribute power in different ways, especially in terms of leadership and decision making in those countries, and in this case, and specifically to Africa. So I mentioned earlier that we work with a variety of partners. Those partners receive multi-million and in some instances billions of dollars to help us do our work. Well, most of those partners tend to be white Ivy League institutions or well-established institutions that then pass the money through to people on the ground or organizations on the ground who actually do the work. We are actively thinking through our DEI strategies and some of the work that we're doing. How do we shift the power and go direct to identify our partners, or whether you have an expat population, how do you begin to build sort of like the local talent and the local base to shift power and decision making to the people who are so greatly impacted? So I think that those are some of the things that we are absolutely actively working on. But the impact that COVID and sort of the race inequities that we've been focused on here in the United States have moved all around the globe. And I think that other countries are dealing with, for the first time, a lot of the same issues that we are just coming to fully face in the United States.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie. And as we begin to close down kind of the panel here, I want to ask a couple of questions and just let everyone know that the audience is beginning to ask about, if you don't have a lot of diversity in the organization, you don't have diverse voices, how do you approach this? And before Shinder, I think you have a really good strategy that you'd like to share of what the work that you're doing at Fortive. I wanted to ask you, Candy, this seems so complicated, and yet it could be so simple, right? What do you recommend in terms of the approach, to having these kinds of conversations? What's it all about?
Well, I think, I sometimes start these conversations with asking people to raise their hand if they believe they deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. And nearly no matter where I go, everyone raises their hand and says, yes, I deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. And then I ask the second question, to raise your hand if you treat everyone who you interact with, from the time you leave your house or wake up in the morning in your own family, to the people who you pass in the streets, to the people who serve you coffee, the people who you work with, and to the people who you interact with when you pick up your kids from school. And I ask you to raise your hand if you treat everyone with dignity and respect, and not all hands go up. And what I can tell you is that without an organization asking you to do it, without your CEO asking you to do it, without your D&I leader asking you to do it, or your BRG asking you to do it, this is a choice that we all get to make every single day. And I think that at the foundation of diversity and inclusion is how we're willing to treat each other. And so even if you happen to be in an organization that doesn't have a D&I leader, or perhaps you don't have a master plan, just start with being respectful to people who are like you and unlike you. These are not things that in many cases other people have to ask you to do. Right. It's who you speak to, It's how you engage with others. It's making new friends. It's asking questions respectfully if you don't understand so that you can learn. But it's a willingness that begins with us as individuals that does not require our organization to have a master plan. Now, we hope they do, but in the absence of one, it can start with you.
Thank you. So simple in so many ways, and yet so complicated to roll out at this particular time. Shinder, I wanted to ask you, how at Fortive are you structuring these conversations while people are frightened, they don't necessarily know what to say? How are you equipping them to move forward?
Yeah, I think you hit on a key piece here, right? That some people are really, they don't know what to say, right? They don't know how to start the conversation. So one of the things that we are doing is we've just launched Courageous Conversations. And we had we've got a workforce of about 26,000 people across the globe. And we have 20 operating companies. So each operating company has a president. So every single president is expected to have a courageous conversation. And what we've done is, but we've made it opt-in. We sent an email to say, how many of you want to opt in to have this dialogue? Because not everybody wants to talk, not everybody feels comfortable, not everybody's there. What's been interesting, and I really debated this, is we made it open to everybody. And we had a big debate in our organization that why don't we just open it up to people of color or African Americans or Blacks. But I really felt it was important to, if we are all going to create take the action together, then we need to also be able to have those dialogues and understand each other. And I was proved right yesterday, because I was thought, should I have done that? Shouldn't I? Do people of color really just also need a safe space? But yesterday was one of the sessions we had, and I will say to you that, and it was a mixture. We're keeping them very small, so we have no more than 10 to 15 people. We have the leader there, the HR leader. Their role is just to listen. And I've been very blunt with them. Your role is to kick it off, say a couple of words, and then to keep quiet. I moderate the session. So that's one thing we are doing. I'll come back and share a little bit of my learnings from that. The other one is we're having manager sessions just with the leadership team, because what they've said, we put out guidance right when it happened to say, communicate that you're there, and that you're there if they need you. And it's also okay to say that you don't have to reply to this, because some people don't want to talk, or they feel because my leader sent me a note to say I'm here for you, now I have to reply. And so, so communicate that you're there if they need it. When they do need it, you have to listen. Educate yourself. We gave a reading list and other, different materials, and then be an ally. So those are the 4 pointers we gave them. We sent it in a 1-pager. So the replies I got back when we sent it to our leaders to say, well, oh my gosh, if they come and talk to me, what do I say? How do I deal with that conversation? And so we're having sessions with our managers in create a safe space for them to say, what questions do you have, right? How do you deal with this? And then it was real, one of the questions was, I've had somebody come to me to say, all lives matter, right? So how do I tell somebody that, how do I deal with that? So it was those kind of topics that in those safe space for the managers, and to build their skills and get them comfortable, leaning in and having these tough conversations, because I think that's, as we've said, I think Candy said it, race is not being talked about in the workplace. Before, many companies were saying, you leave that at the door, right? Just like with CV19, I know now we are openly talking about mental health and well-being, whereas that was another topic, that was a taboo topic. So we're having those manager sessions. And then the last thing is really how we amping up our existing strategy, right? The whole awareness and skills building. So there's a whole raft of work that's going to be going on there. So those are the kind of things we're doing. And going back to the Courageous Conversation session, so yesterday, you know, an African-American colleague of ours opened up, and he had shared that while on duty at work for our operating company on a sales call, he got stopped by the police. Now, for some, you know, of our colored friends, that's not new, right? He got stopped by the police at gunpoint. And one of the other ladies who was on the, you know, part of that small group, a white lady, she started, it was very emotional, right? Started crying. And you know, what she said was, you hear about it in the news, you hear the stories, but she said, but because this happened to you, and I work with you, it's happening to you, somebody I personally know, it's almost like a wake up, right? And so that, I think, was the power of having a mixed group, because really hearing the stories of people and what they're going through was very, very powerful. So, so those, I just kind of wanted to share a little bit of the insight around, you know, the decision to have a mixed group versus, you know, just one separate groups. But those are the things that we've started to do.
No, thank you so much, Shinder. Really appreciate the guidance there. I know that our panelists are extremely busy at this time where they're being called upon to represent both internally and externally. And so I will first thank the panelists before I provide one just administrative note, because I know that especially Candy, you have to attend a speaking conference, and wanted to just again thank you very much for joining us in this candid conversation. Hope that you've enjoyed the experience. Candy, Shinder, Leslie, thank you very much. I know when you need to go, please do dial off. And wanted to mention that we are going to be launching an inclusive leadership e-learning for everyone on the phone. We're making it available to you. You will receive an email that you can register and actually start to develop some of these inclusive leadership skills. In addition to that, we'll be launching a survey on how to stand up a D&I function and asking questions to share back in some thought leadership. And then finally, we will be issuing a thought leadership paper on the next frontier in D&I, which is developing your diverse leadership pipeline. And with that, again, I would like to thank the panelists for their time. Really appreciate it.